So after the little thing where I had you guys put different things into columns about whether they were alive, not alive, or were never alive, there's a section that says explain the characteristics of life described by the book. Essentially, these characteristics are rules that textbooks use to decide whether or not something is alive or not alive. One of those things is order. Essentially, what order means is you're keeping things where they're supposed to be, like you're keeping the outside out and the inside in. You're just maintaining things where they're supposed to be. All living things have the ability to do that. Next up, all living things can respond to the environment or react to stimuli, whichever way you want to say that. So here you've got this vulture. It's looking for rotting flesh because that's what it eats. And so it's responding to the sight of roadkill, the smell of dead rotting animal on said road, and when it sees those things, it's going to respond by landing next to that thing and then starting to eat that. Now, plants can also respond to stimuli. This one's kind of an obvious one. The Venus flytrap has caught this. I think this is a damselfly. But even just like a regular plant, their leaves can follow the sunlight, and so they're responding to that light that's available to them. Even bacteria can respond to the environment. And so the movement doesn't necessarily have to be big or great or anything, but it does have to be some sort of a response to the environment. Next up, reproduction. All living things have to be able to reproduce either sexually or asexually. These guys all reproduce sexually because they're animals. Some animals can reproduce asexually, but these are vertebrates, and very few vertebrates can do asexual reproduction. I want to say there's some gross pictures coming up on the next slides. I do love to throw gross pictures in there at you guys. I've had students come back years later and tell me those are the pictures they remember, so I keep them in there. Ooh, look at the gross seahorse. Okay, it's not that bad on this one. But one of the other things that all organisms need to be able to do is adapt to the environment around them, because the environment is not static. It does not stay the same. It changes over time, whether it's because lightning struck and started a fire, or flooding changed an area that used to have trees, now the trees are all gone. Everything does change over time. One of the things that's happening right now is climate change. Climate change has already changed the temperatures of the ocean, and what that does is it stresses coral out. When coral gets stressed out, it throws out the algae that had lived inside of it that gave coral its color, and that results in coral bleaching. Well, this little seahorse is adapted for living in a nice healthy coral reef where the coral is this pink color, and so if you were a predatory fish, you wouldn't see this seahorse right now. But if due to climate change this coral bleached, now this kind of pinky red seahorse sticks out, and it's going to be easier for predatory fish to find the seahorse and eat it. So it would have to be able to adapt as the coral bleached due to climate change. The typical example that kind of goes along with adaptation and evolution is the peppered moths from over in Europe. That's an example that we'll talk about again a little bit later on. This is an example that I always talk about in my class at this point. One of the things that the human race has been doing since the 1940s is pressuring bacteria by using antibiotics to treat bacterial infections. And unfortunately, when we first had antibiotics, we even used them to treat viral infections, which they don't work on. The result of applying the pressure of antibiotic to bacteria is that it doesn't kill all bacteria. It kills bacteria that is susceptible to the antibiotic, but some members of a population stay behind, and because they were resistant to the antibiotic, when they start to overgrow and cause an infection, the person is now resistant to, and let me rephrase that, the population in the person is now resistant to antibiotics, and so they have what's known as an antimicrobial resistant infection. One of the more common versions of that is something called MRSA, which is methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. It's a specific strain of Staph aureus, which is resistant to both penicillin and methicillin. So you have to give them antibiotics that are stronger and tend to have a higher risk of side effects. There are even strains of Staph aureus that are resistant to the next line of drugs, which is vancomycin. They're called vancomycin-resistant Staph aureus, and so it becomes very difficult to treat those infections. So one of the things the human race has had to do since the evolution of antibiotic resistance is we've had to find ways to treat infections that aren't treatable with the drugs that we have. And that's where we get to this gross picture off over here. This is an odd picture. You're looking at somebody's foot. This person is diabetic and most of their toes have been amputated. There's one little toe left behind at this point. People who are diabetic are prone to amputations, and they're prone to something called neuropathy. And what that means is they can't feel their feet very well. And so what will happen is, like as their shoe rubs up against their heel, they get a blister. And they don't know the blister is there because they can't feel it because the nerves have been deadened in that area. Well, then that blister gets infected, and then that infection spreads all without the person knowing it because they can't feel any of that happening. Well, if the diabetic person ends up with MRSA, you can't give a diabetic vancomycin very easily because vancomycin is toxic to the kidneys, and diabetics also tend to have problems with their kidneys. And so what's happening, and again, I'm going to warn you, this is gross, they have stuffed maggots into this person's wound because maggots eat dead decaying flesh, but they don't eat healthy tissue. And so that's the only way we could cure this person of their antibiotic-resistant infection is pack their wound with maggots to eat the infected material out of there. That's us adapting to the fact that bacteria have already adapted and become resistant to those antibiotics. And so adaptation is something that all organisms, from bacteria through humans, has to be able to do. I won't talk about those two. I'll skip right past those. Growth and development is what you have next. Growth is fairly obvious. An organism gets bigger, usually by adding more cells. Development is usually you mature as you get older, and by mature, usually that means becomes capable of sexual reproduction. So plants, they can't just reproduce from the moment they hatch out of their acorn. They have to mature and develop just like humans do as well. Regulation and homeostasis really go together. Homeostasis is how we regulate our internal environment, and regulation is just the process of keeping everything in a nice stable state. So this picture I took in San Francisco when I was out on vacation there ages ago. While we were there, the water in the bay was in the 50-degree Fahrenheit sort of range, so it was chilly water. So all of these little sea lions came up and they were sunning themselves on these piers at Fisherman's Wharf, and they were doing that to help regulate their internal temperature to help them maintain homeostasis. And living things have to be able to do that. Living things also have to be able to process energy. We do this by consuming food, breaking that food down, and then using molecules in the food as an energy source so that we can power our muscles and our brains as we do various activities. All right. This is another one that sometimes gets mentioned in some textbooks, but all living things are made of cells, and all cells have genetic material inside of them, usually in the form of DNA. And so I do want you to go ahead and add this because it's a very important characteristic of life. So what we're going to do now is we're going to come back and we're going to talk about those things that I mentioned earlier, and we're going to reevaluate whether or not these organisms possess those characteristics of life that we mentioned. So frogs, they maintain order, they can respond to stimuli and go catch a bug, they can reproduce, they have eggs, they lay them in the water, they hatch into tadpoles, and so on. They can adapt, although they are having problems adapting to a fungus, so a lot of frogs are going extinct right now. They can grow in development, they undergo that metamorphosis to get from a tadpole to where they're going. They maintain homeostasis, they process energy, they have genes, they're made of cells. Potato. Now, potato is something that usually gets a fair amount of debate as students are doing discussion board sort of things. I don't know if you guys have ever left a potato in your pantry for too long, but it starts to sprout. And if you were to take that potato and go throw it in a pile of dirt, it would grow and produce a new plant. So a potato is alive. It's capable of reproduction, it's capable of energy processing and growth and development and all of that sort of jazz. And so unless you have cooked it, it is still a living thing. Pine tree, alive. Earthworm, alive. Pollen is another one that tends to get some debate. Pollen, if you are unaware, contains the sex cells for plants, specifically their sperm inside of pollen. So my question for you is, if I had put sperm on this list, would you have considered sperm alive? Well, human sperm swims around to find an egg, and so that movement usually gets people to realize sperm is alive. Well, if there's sperm in pollen, that means the pollen is alive as well. Never alive. Rocks, never alive. Yogurt is something that we need to kind of discuss, so I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Fire. Fire is another one that can take a little bit of discussion. If you've ever talked to a firefighter, many of them kind of consider fire to be a living thing. It can reproduce. It does breathe or process energy. However, it can't adapt. It's not made of cells. So it's sort of something that straddles the line. So what I usually like to talk about as we talk about fire is you and I do not have to agree on anything as we go through this course. However, if we disagree, you have to be able to defend your reasoning and I have to be able to defend my reasoning. So if I were going to come out on the side of I think fire is alive, I would have to be able to tell you why I think that. It can reproduce, it can process energy, it can grow and get bigger. That's a living thing if you can do some of those things on those characteristics. And so that's kind of what I want you guys to do. If you want to come down on the side of fire is not alive, you would have to be able to say, well, it doesn't maintain order very well. It can't adapt from an evolutionary standpoint. And so just defend yourself and we're going to be okay there. The sun is just a sustained chemical reaction. It is not a living thing. Viruses are another one that we're going to talk about kind of with yogurt. Okay. A virus is made of nucleic acid and a protein coat, and that's it. It's not made of cells. It can't reproduce on its own. It can't process energy on its own. It can't regulate its own internal environment. It can't grow. It can't develop. It can't respond to stimuli. It does maintain order, though. It can reproduce. If it gets into a living cell, it will trick that cell into making more copies of it. So there are some biologists that adamantly say a virus is a living thing and you can kill them. And there are other scientists that say a virus isn't alive. It's not made of cells and it can't reproduce on its own. It's just tricking a cell into doing it. So once again, defend yourself and you're going to be okay there. Yogurt is a similar sort of thing. Yogurt is made in a fermentation process by bacteria. And the bacteria in the yogurt is absolutely a living thing. But is yogurt the fermented milk plus the bacteria? Or if you were to kill all the bacteria in yogurt, would it still be yogurt and therefore yogurt was never alive because it's just fermented milk? Be able to defend your answer there. Paper used to be alive because it came from trees. Usually trees are alive, and dead mouse used to be a living mouse, and so that was alive. One of the other things that I kind of want to stipulate as we're going through this and talking about what isn't alive, different organizations have different definitions for what is alive. Now, NASA goes out to other planets and they look for living things. So they have a definition of life. Their definition of life is that there must be some type of genetic material and the organism must be capable of reproduction. Well, I am no longer capable of reproduction because I'm an old person. Does that mean I'm not alive anymore? Well, according to NASA's definition, it does. I tend to disagree with NASA's definition because I consider myself to be a living thing. So once again, defend your answer and you're going to be okay on that. Everybody's definition is a little bit different, and so which of those characteristics do you think is the most important, and why do you think that? And as long as you can defend yourself, we're going to be golden in here. Okay, next up you have from the smallest to the largest, what are the levels of organization of living things? It's going to start down here and work its way up. So number 1, atoms is actually where it's going to start right here. Atoms are the smallest unit of matter, like you can have an atom of oxygen and an atom of hydrogen. Get a couple of atoms together, you can make a molecule. So number 2, molecule. That's 2 or more atoms put together. Like the oxygen that you breathe in is actually 2 oxygen atoms bonded together. It's an oxygen molecule. Water is a molecule. DNA is a big molecule. Number 3 is not on this picture. It's macromolecule. That's M-A-C-R-O and then molecule. That prefix macro literally means big. So macromolecules are big molecules like DNA or carbohydrates or proteins. Next up, number 4 is an organelle. They've given you nucleus as an example, but the one everybody always remembers from high school is mitochondria. Number 5 is the cell. The cell is the smallest unit that's alive. So in other words, an organelle like a mitochondria, not alive by itself. A molecule of water, not alive ever. An atom, not alive. But a cell is a living thing. So cells are the smallest unit of life. It is important that you understand that some organisms are only made of one cell, others have multiple cells. If we have an organism that is made out of multiple cells, the next level up is the tissue. It's a group of cells with a function. They gave you nervous tissue for an example, but epithelial tissue, muscle tissue, and connective tissue are other examples. Get a few tissues together and then you can get an organ. They gave you brain as an example, but so is heart or stomach or any number of organs in your body. Get a bunch of organs together, then you get an organ system. The brain's part of the nervous system, stomach's part of the digestive system, heart's part of the circulatory system. Get a bunch of organ systems together, then you get an organism, which is one single living thing, like you are a single living thing. Now here's where I'm going to go back to a bacterial cell, like that Staph aureus that was causing the person problems earlier. Bacteria is single-celled, which means they don't get tissues because a tissue is a group of cells, but they're only made of one cell. So in the bacterial world, they jump straight from cell to organism, and they skip those levels of organization. All right, continuing on. So number 9 was organism. Number 10 is population. Here that is. It's a group of one species in one place at one time. A community is all the populations in one place at one time. An ecosystem is all the communities plus abiotic factors like water availability, temperature, things like that. And then you put all the ecosystems together, and then you get the biosphere, which is the whole planet plus the atmosphere that helps to support that planet. Underneath that list, you have which level of organization is the smallest unit to be considered alive. That would be cell. Let's see. Then you have, there's 2 kinds of cells. Sorry, stuff I didn't want to talk about in here that I should take out and keep forgetting to do. 2 types of cells present on Earth, prokaryotic and eukaryotic. Prokaryotic cells are smaller. They do not have a nucleus. They don't have any of the organelles that you were taught in high school, like rough ER, smooth ER, Golgi apparatus, mitochondria. None of that stuff is present. These have been on the planet for a much longer time, and I'm talking a billion years longer than eukaryotic cells have been on the planet. Bacteria are made out of prokaryotic cells. So is a group of organisms called archaeans. Eukaryotic cells includes plant cells, animal cells, fungal cells. Eukaryotic cells are much bigger than prokaryotic cells, and they do have all those organelles like a nucleus, rough ER, mitochondria. In the case of plants, chloroplasts are in there as well. Explain the hierarchical taxonomy that Carl Linnaeus proposed. So they usually cover this pretty well in high school. Hopefully this is ringing some bells for some of you, but here's the system that he developed. Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Now, since the 1990s, there has been a new taxon that was added. Linnaeus is long dead, so he didn't add it. It was a guy named Carl Woese, but above the kingdom, now there's a D for domain. Species is the smallest, most specific grouping. For example, humans are Homo sapiens. Humans are the only thing that are part of that species. Dogs are the only thing in Canis familiaris. As you move up the taxonomy, though, you start to get more broad. So the dog is in the same genus as the wolf is. They're both in that genus Canis, and so both dogs and wolves go in here. They're in the family Canidae, which all the dogs are going to be in, including the African wild dog. They're in the order, I got to think about this for a second. Oh my goodness. Carnivora is the order that they're in. Sorry that took me so long. Because they are mostly meat eaters. They're in the class Mammalia because they have hair, fur, and mammary glands. They're in the phylum Chordata because they have a vertebral column. They're in the kingdom Animalia, but so are fish. And fish aren't all that similar to dogs off down here. So as you move up, things get a lot more broad. After that, you have what is a domain. It's the taxon that is above the kingdom. It is the broadest group. Every living thing on the planet is put into one of 3 domains. When was it added to the hierarchy? In the 1990s. How many domains are there? 3. The 3 are listed on here, and I'll talk about them really briefly. There's the domain bacteria, that Staph aureus that we talked about earlier. It's in the domain bacteria. There's the domain archaea. This domain has organisms that we only discovered in the 1970s, really, when we found out that things live in places where we didn't think things lived, like the Dead Sea or hydrothermal vents. Those organisms tend to live in pretty extreme environments. Both the domain bacteria and the domain archaea consist of prokaryotic cells with no nucleus. The third domain is the domain eukarya. All of these groups, they have cells that do have a nucleus. Let's see. Explain Linnaeus's binomial naming system. The genus and species makes up the scientific name of any organism. So again, humans are Homo sapiens, which is what's written up here. Dogs are Canis familiaris. An oak tree, like a live oak, is Quercus virginiana. Everything has its own binomial name, and it's written in Latin. Exactly how do you write a scientific name? Well, it depends on if you're typing it or if you're handwriting it. If you're typing it, it should be italicized with the genus capitalized. The species does not get capitalized. If you're handwriting it, it's written and you underline it, but it's still capital and then lowercase for those names, but you underline it instead of italicizing it. What is your scientific name? That would be the Homo sapiens that is written right out here for you. And since you guys are more than likely handwriting it, you would write it and underline it exactly like that. That gets you through that first half of chapter 1.